Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Should Out-of-School Staff Be Trained Like Teachers? My name is Nora Fleming and I'm a reporter here at Education Week. Underwriting for today's webinar is made possible by a grant from the Wallace Foundation. This webinar stems from a story I wrote a little while ago titled Training of Out-of-School Staff Debated that looked at some of the challenges facing OST programs in providing professional development for their staff and the continued debate over what core competencies OST staff should possess. Many members of the after-school community believe that to improve the quality of out-of-school time programs, professional development for staff also needs to improve. But given that many OST programs have tight resources and their staff members are typically young, part-time workers that are hard to retain, providing professional development that is both high quality and cost-effective is often a challenge. Some members of the OST community believe staff need to be seen by others and themselves as professionals who require defined skills, with some competencies overlapping those of classroom teachers and others unique to after-school workers. Today, two experts from the OST community will look at how these programs can provide professional development that increases staff effectiveness while maintaining staff distinctiveness from traditional school day teachers. We're joined by Nancy Peter, who's the founder and director of the Out-of-School Time Resource Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Nancy has worked in informal science education, OST programming, and professional development for over 3 decades. We also have Charles Smith here, who's the executive director of the David P. Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and vice president for research at the Forum for Youth Investment here in Washington. Before we begin, now's a good time to review some of the technical aspects of today's presentation. We want this to be an interactive experience, so send in your questions by simply typing them into the Ask a Question box and hitting Submit. Please check the audio setting on your computer as well as your speaker volume settings if you're having any audio trouble. If you're having other difficulties, try clicking the Help button for support. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available online in the next 24 hours. Both the archive and the free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. Now I'd like to hand over the presentation to Nancy Peter.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Nancy Peter, and I'm here at the Out-of-School Time Resource Center at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. I'm going to give the first half of this presentation and then turn it over to my colleague, Charles Smith. The Out-of-School Time Resource Center at Penn has been here since 2003, and essentially we support staff who support children and youth. Our services and our supports are entirely geared towards out-of-school time, after-school youth worker staff. We provide a variety of resources, an online training calendar, monthly peer networking meetings, regional directories, and individual consultations. And we also conduct research on and evaluate OST professional development. And really our goal is to advocate for quality professional development, to allow people to access multiple types of PD, and also to provide a diversity of forums and media through which people can get PD, as well as to evaluate professional development. So before moving into my presentation, I find that it's always useful to have a set of terms that we all agree to. And for today, for this webinar, I'm going to use the National Institute on Out-of-School Time's definition of out-of-school time. And that is out-of-school time are formal programs that happen for school-age children during non-school hours, which can be after school, before school, on weekends, during the summer, and other school breaks, as well as evenings, which I didn't mention there. And I also use the National Staff Development Council's definition of professional development, which is, again, a very broad definition. Professional development is anything really that enhances the performance of a practitioner. So I don't use professional development synonymously with workshops and conferences, but professional development can be peer networking, mentors, online communities, as well as technical assistance and workshops and conferences. So that's the premise upon which I'm going to do the rest of my presentation. So to assume that professional development is important, there's a couple of assumptions, I think, that lead into that. And a lot of this is relevant to classroom teachers as well as to out-of-school time staff. And the first assumption is that professional development enhances staff quality. And there's a lot of research, and you'll all be able to access that research, I believe, in the archives, that makes a very, very distinct connection between professional development and improved staff quality, which I'll be talking about what that means in a minute. There's also research that demonstrates that staff quality directly contributes to OSD program quality. And lastly, that program quality positively impacts children and youth. It's sometimes hard from a research perspective to make a direct link between professional development and youth impact, so it's important sometimes to look at these three tiers of research to make the connection from the first to the last. In talking about out-of-school time staff, there are a lot of similarities with classroom teachers. There's a lot of considerations when you're developing professional development, whether it's for out-of-school time staff or for classroom teachers. But there are a number of things that are very, very unique to out-of-school time staff, which, again, have to be thought about when you're developing their professional development. Out-of-school time staff often come into the field, whether they're administrative or whether they're direct service, with really diverse academic and experiential backgrounds. Our staff here, for instance, have backgrounds in anthropology, science, music, and writing. So one of the wonderful things about OST is that it attracts diverse staff, but it also means that developing professional development can be a little bit more complicated. In terms of training, ongoing training for out-of-school time staff, there are not that many. I wouldn't say there are none, but there are minimal core competencies that are currently in place. So again, sometimes it's hard to figure out both what staff should be doing and also the areas where they may be, I wouldn't say deficient, but maybe needing more training, and how that compares to other regions. So there is minimal standardization of core competencies. Out-of-school time staff are expected to do many, many, many things, which again contributes to sort of the complexity of professional development. So depending on the funder, depending on the climate, depending on the year, depending on what's really prevalent among youth right now, it can be academics, it can be project-based learning, it can be civic engagement. Right now there's a lot of interest in out-of-school time as far as health and fitness, science education, engineering, and math. So this really contributes to a very robust but also continually changing professional development climate. Everybody in our field agrees that out-of-school time staff aren't compensated the way they should be, and sometimes this has to do with just wages, sometimes it has to do with benefits, has to do with retirement, health benefits, which can make it difficult to retain staff, which goes to the second to the last bullet, is that there's frequent turnover among out-of-school time staff. And something I'll talk about a little later on is sometimes a reluctance to invest in out-of-school time staff because they may not be in the position that long. Minimal perceived or recognized professional identity. Classroom teachers, they belong to a field, they graduate with a degree, they work in a building with lots of other people doing similar things. I was thinking today, I just received my doctorate. My mother's very proud of me. She still doesn't know what I do. So out-of-school time as a profession, as a professional identity, is sometimes a little bit elusive. And finally, assessment of professional development for out-of-school time staff is evolving, but in many places it still hasn't gotten beyond satisfaction with the professional development experience. So I wouldn't call all of these concerns or challenges, but they're considerations for developing an individual PD intervention or developing a system of professional development. In terms of design, there's more and more literature, more and more resources, more and more templates for how to design quality, effective PD. And quality PD would be defined as something that's engaging to the staff, that results in application, and that has a positive impact on the children and youth that they serve. In designing professional development, just like with classroom teachers, it's important to be aware of how adults learn. So to integrate adult learning theory, multiple intelligences, theory of change, three very academic terms, but Adults are similar to and different from kids. So adults bring in their own experiences. Adults like to have a real-life application. Adults generally like to work in teams and have people to bounce ideas off of. And whether you're designing a conference or a workshop or a technical assistance session, being cognizant of and integrating adult learning theory is really important. There are also, I did say before, there are minimal staff competencies, but the staff competencies and quality staff competencies are being developed monthly. And some of them are on a state, some of them are on a regional, some of them are on a national or a local level. The three that I have here are just examples. The National After School Association published its staff competencies last year, which are a series of things that all people that work with kids during non-school hours should be able to know and do. Schools Out Washington has a set of excellent state competencies, and Philadelphia is working on a set of OST staff competencies that were first developed in 2009. Somebody asked me, why have different sets? Why local? Why regional? Why national? I think it's important for all three of them to reinforce each other and certainly not to contradict one another. But, for instance, in Philadelphia, there are local initiatives, there are local priorities that will distinguish Philadelphia's competencies from another cities or states or certainly from the national competencies. Different formats. I mentioned earlier on that we are big advocates of diverse formats for professional development. I will mention that there are more and more credentialed programs excuse me, that contribute to preparing staff as one form of professional development for their fields of youth work and out-of-school time. And there are associate's degrees, credential degrees, bachelor's degrees, and master's degrees. And we can send out, if folks are interested, lists of where to find this information and partial lists of these programs as they actually are. In terms of multiple formats, we're big supporters of workshops and conferences, but more and more interest in and energy devoted to and research demonstrating the effectiveness of things like one-on-one adult coaching, mentoring, peer networking. Peer networking can be in person, it can be virtual, as well as, speaking of virtual, webinars, listservs, and other types of online bulletin boards. And all of these professional development venues are increasingly being used in the out-of-school time field. We do a lot of evaluation, excuse me, of out-of-school time, professional development, and a lot of our evaluation is based on one of my gurus, who is Thomas Guskey, and he literally wrote the book on evaluating professional development. And he asserts that there are several levels that one can evaluate professional development, and then unfortunately for both classroom teachers and out-of-school time staff, sometimes we stop at satisfaction. Did you enjoy the venue? Did you enjoy the conference? Did you enjoy the workshop? But what we really need to do when we assess PD is look at whether or not individuals acquired new knowledge and skills, whether there was institutional integration and support, because if you go back to your organization and you don't have the support, it's never going to go any further than that. Whether the new skills and knowledge were applied in the program with youth. The Out-of-School Time Resource Center added the part on extension, which means was this professional development information applied to different age groups, different populations? Was it shared with other adults? And finally, youth impact, which is, in our field, the true goal of effective professional development. There's two other bullets here in parentheses. We've begun to measure increases in perception of professional identity. So we're interested in, as a result of participating in PD, do people feel like they belong to a field? Do they feel proud of their participation in a field? Do they feel that they want to stay in the field? All relating to professional identity. And also change in belief system. And there's research on concerns-based adoption model, which asserts that if people don't have a change in their belief in the importance of a topic, they're not going to go on to the application and extension and youth impact. So we also tend to evaluate change in the belief of a topic or a concept or a behavior as it pertains to application. I was also asked to provide an example of a type of PD that maybe integrates several of the promising practices that were in my previous slides. So I picked one of ours, which is the Out-of-School Time Resource Center's monthly peer networking meetings. These happen at our local United Way. Anybody is invited. We invite folks from different regions, direct service staff as well as administrative staff. They're free of charge. And we've been hosting these for many, many years. They are based on and sorted by Philadelphia staff competencies. So the way that we determine the topics, for example, are based on the taxonomy of what we think that our youth workers should know and be able to do. We integrate adult learning theories specifically about people bringing in past experiences and making sure that we integrate applications, practical applications. Multiple learning styles, we have panels, we have question and answer, we have informal networking, we have formalized networking activities. We also do a very robust evaluation of our peer networking meetings. So we have paper surveys, we have sometimes mid-year online surveys, sometimes we have end-of-year summative surveys. We've also done long-term impact evaluation as well as more qualitative evaluation. So we've done observations and focus groups. So we're pretty sure that we understand what's going on in our peer networking meetings. And we're really happy to say that they've proven successful on a lot of levels, including back to the evaluation slide of satisfaction, acquisition of skills and knowledge, and application. And the last thing I'm going to touch on, which are more questions than imparting wisdom, are some of the remaining challenges for out-of-school time professional development, some of which I have an opinion about, some of which I think I may have solved, most of which I'm really not sure about. One lingering question or challenge is how to finance out-of-school time professional development. And those of us in the field know it's very, very hard sometimes to fundraise for professional development when you can't identify the number of individual youth that are going to be impacted by your services. I think it's really hard to design professional development when the content area is a moving target. So sometimes our staff need to be really versed in science, and sometimes they need to be really versed in basketball. That makes it difficult for the field to keep up. I think it's difficult to impress that staff should be invested in when there is a lot of turnover. I'd like to think that if you invest in a staff person and they stay in the field, that you've invested in the field, but sometimes that's not an easy argument to make. And the last two lingering issues that I have here on this slide are how to reconcile experience with credentials. As we're becoming more standardized and as we're developing more credential programs, and ideally, as more programs are requiring their staff to be credentialed, where does that leave people who have been in the program for a long time, who don't have the degrees, or people who are wanting to enter the field who have diverse but not necessarily credentialed backgrounds? And this relates to the last one. How do we standardize a profession that by definition is very diverse, very robust, and very, very full of different topics and experiences? And this is my contact information on the final slide.
Thank you, Nancy. And now I'd like to hand over the presentation to Charles for the second part.
Thank you, Nora. Hello, everyone. Thanks for taking time to participate in this conversation about staff training in the out-of-school time field. The title for my presentation today is A Continuous Improvement Approach for Out-of-School Time Staff Learning and Performance. At the end of the presentation, I'll perhaps venture an answer to the question about should out-of-school time staff and school day staff be trained in the same way, and I think probably like many folks on the phone, my answer to that would be perhaps yes and perhaps no. So I want to talk a little bit in between now and that fairly obvious answer. The frame I'm going to bring to this presentation, I'm going to describe a specific intervention for out-of-school time organizations designed to raise the quality of staff performance in a specific place where they meet the kids and deliver instruction or adult-child interaction in those settings. The frame is continuous quality improvement, which, as you'll see, I think gets us to a very similar kind of place that Nancy's really excellent presentation about professional development does. They end up in the same place, but on the way, we use some different language, and we focus, I think, a bit more explicitly on organizational practices and processes that result in changed performance by staff in the setting where they meet the kids. A quick note on the organization, the David P. Weichert Center for Youth Program Quality. We have been around for about 10 years doing this work, first at the High Scope Educational Research Foundation, and then through a joint venture with the Forum for Youth Investment in Washington, D.C., and now full-time with the Forum. We are located in Ypsilanti, Michigan. Our primary work is to bring standards-based improvement processes for quality to the out-of-school time field, especially through the creation of quality improvement systems. A note on terms. I'll use the term teacher and youth worker pretty interchangeably here. There are two terms of art in the out-of-school time field. In our work in after-school programs, we deal with just about as many teachers as we do youth workers. Also, I'll talk about instruction, but I also mean adult-child interaction, or you can, if instruction sounds like a school day term, you can say instruction appropriate to out-of-school time and after-school settings. So there are a number of challenges to adult learning in the out-of-school time field, challenges to staff training and professional development paradigms. I just want to mention a couple and say that the intervention I'm going to describe, the Youth Program Quality Intervention, fairly obvious title, was designed to really directly address a number of these challenges, actually all of these challenges, and Nancy alluded to a number of these already. They're widely known in the out-of-school time field, so I'll just review this briefly. First of all, in the out-of-school time field, it's really tough to define improved performance, and since that's the point of professional development, or in most cases the point, if the same kids are not in the program all year long or year to year, if programs and settings are designed to produce different kinds of outcomes for kids, it's very difficult to put a single metric for child-level change into place and evaluate performance of the organization based on that measure. The same is true if out-of-school time programs welcome expertise from many different fields and with different kinds of qualifications into the setting to have a community's expertise available to kids. It's difficult to say that a person working in an out-of-school time setting has to have one particular kind of degree. These are strengths of after-school, but at the same time they make measuring performance very difficult, and so in the face of that challenge, we have focused on what the teachers do rather than how the kids learn. It's not that the kids' learning isn't important. It's not that child outcomes aren't front and center in much of our work, but for this discussion about professional development, we're really focused on how the adults work with the kids and measuring that performance in the setting with the kids. The others are also well known in the field. There's very high turnover in the out-of-school time field, so we focus on site supervisors as carriers of a continuous improvement practice that ultimately improves instruction at the front line where the kids are. The kitchen sink problem with standards and competencies. The field is maturing and developing standards and competencies, very valuable to define what good is, but at the same time, these lists can be so long that if you equally weight every item, you end up not paying much attention to, again, the instruction or adult-child interaction that is delivered to the kids, the child experience available in the setting. So while all standards and competencies are certainly important, our work has been really focused on child experience, what the adults are doing with the kids. Changing behavior is more difficult than changing ideas. And so we tried to incorporate performance feedback, real-time counts of here's what you did with the kids today. What do you think about that? Does that fit your perception of what you did with the kids today? And finally, evaluation, accountability, and professional development all run typically issues that are handled by very skilled people in separate offices with separate budgets and separate agendas. And we believe that the more you can bring the evaluation, accountability requirements, and professional development resources together into a common mission for how adults learn and deliver certain kinds of performances for kids, the more resources you've got to work for to achieve those ends. There are two elements to the presentation, the youth PQA and the YPQI. We've only been doing this for a decade. We're fairly early in this intervention. It takes a long time to figure this kind of work out, so we're not very original in our acronyms. The youth PQA is our measure of teacher practice. It's an observational measure. And the YPQI, the Youth Program Quality Intervention, is the intervention we do with organizations to use the youth PQA to do continuous quality improvement of instruction. The YPQI consists of 4 core practices, what we call continuous improvement practices. First, I'd like to discuss the Youth Program Quality Assessment. Here, a pyramid which represents our standard for staff instructional practice with kids at the point of service. This is certainly not the only standard of best practice that could be created for the way adults work with kids, but it has been a widely accepted one, and we've spent a lot of time trying to create a validation argument for it. It consists of 4 primary domains: safe environment, supportive environment, interaction and engagement, and 61 items that nest within those 4 domains. You'll recognize the parallel to Maslow's hierarchy as you look at the structure of the pyramid. There's a lot to talk about here. I won't say a lot. We can come back to this actual standard and metric for how adults work with kids in a setting in the Q&A period. The Youth Program Quality Intervention, so that was the measure of teacher practice. The Youth Program Quality Intervention is the thing we do with staff groups in organizations to help them build continuous improvement systems or adult learning systems within their organization. This is a complex slide. I put it here so that for those of you who like to see how the whole thing fits together, you can. I want to point out 2 elements on this slide. First, that we think about a multi-level approach to building adult learning systems in the out-of-school time field. So while if you look at the right side of the slide in the lime green boxes, the one at the bottom of the page says point of service setting on the side with the text running vertically. That's the classroom in a school day metaphor. It's the activity, the offering in out-of-school time. That place where adults and kids come together nests within an organizational setting, or the site, the building where the program is. And that building nests within a policy. That policy can be formal, as in the 21st Century Learning Centers, or it can be through a connection through a tradition and a brand, as it would be through the YMCA or Boys and Girls Clubs of America, or it can be just an informal network of community organizations in the city of St. Louis, for example, that all try to work together and have some common practices. The YPQI is designed to affect decision-making at each of these levels, and I want to point out 2 key places. First, if you follow the green boxes down to the bottom green box, the point of service setting, the top white box is staff enacts instructional practices, and that's where the pyramid goes, the standard for instructional practice by the staff person. So that prior slide about the youth PQA, that standard would be applied in that box. So that's the measure of practice, and then the primary point of this slide, of course, are the 4 continuous improvement practices listed on the left side in the darker green call-out box. These 4 practices, assess, plan, coach, and train, are the core of the YPQI model, and they are the intervention that we help support a manager, a site manager, to learn how to do, and then that person carries forward with their staff in the setting. Assess, plan, coach, and train are all focused on improving continuous improvement of instruction at the point of service. They could be focused on any other aim of the program as well, for example, parent involvement or relationships with schools. But in our intervention, we have been primarily focused on using those 4 continuous improvement practices to improve the quality of instruction at the point of service where adults meet kids. I'm going to skip this slide and come back to it. So what does the youth program quality intervention look like for one person at an out-of-school time site? Here are a set of bullets that represent a series of actions taken across a school year. Most of the out-of-school time programs that we work with follow a school year calendar. And I'm just going to walk through these bullets real quickly. You'll see that the bold and underlined terms, again, reflect those 4 core practices: assess, plan, coach, and train. So first, a site adopting the Youth Program Quality Intervention in a system of sites that we're adopting the intervention, because we mostly work with systems of after-school and out-of-school time sites. In late October, an individual youth worker or teacher might be asked to join the self-assessment team where they would use the youth PQA to observe each other during their sessions working with kids, collect anecdotal notes, and then come together in a scoring meeting where they would score a single version of this observational assessment tool to produce a rating for the entire site. During that period, external raters might also visit the site and collect a couple of external ratings. Trained to reliability, these external ratings tend to be more accurate in some ways, more reliable scores than self-assessment. Although self-assessment over a period of years does tend to get to mirror external ratings, implying that site managers become more skilled at the process of seeing the practice available in their sites. Next, in mid-November, that staff member would, with their team, join some kind of a planning with data session where they would take the external and self-assessment data about staff performance and decide what they thought it means. They would write a narrative about that data and then come up with a plan. Here are the things that we want to work on as an organization and as individuals. December to June, really for the rest of the year, the improvement plan gets implemented and discussed during monthly staff meetings. So you work in the many ways that you might work to implement improvement items such as we want to increase the amount of reflection that children are engaged in about the content in the sessions that they participate in. Or we want to try to improve, we want to try and have more project-based learning in this session. Or we're doing a lot of work on STEM, and we want to try to use more STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics vocabulary in sessions. Whatever the plan is, they implement for the rest of the year, and the site leader keeps that plan in front of the staff at frequent staff meetings. And then February to March, that staff might start to attend some training modules on specific areas of instruction that were on the plan. For example, reflection, learning how to do reflection with kids, concept mapping or journaling, those kinds of techniques. February and April, that site instructor might walk into various staff's offerings with the youth program quality assessment and collect some data and sit with the staff after the session and score various items that were listed on the improvement plan, again, in a very safe and strength-based way, reflecting both the strengths and the challenges in an individual's practice back to them so that they can decide how they would like to change their performance. In August, so then that completes a year, and then in the second year, the standard for practice, the standard for quality is in place, the continuous quality improvement cycle is known, and the staff can start to build those elements into the program from the very beginning. So as they design activity, as they select curriculum, as they modify curriculum for sessions throughout the year, these standards for quality and for continuous improvement can be built in, and the cycle repeats. So that's the experience of one youth worker. It's worth noting that in our model for the youth program quality intervention, we also like to think about the policy context, and that there are certain approaches to accountability that may be more effective for implementing this kind of a performance change system. We like to talk about higher and lower stakes approaches to accountability, and again, I would be happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but I think for the sake of time, I'll move on. Just know that in the lower stakes model, we're not looking at an absolute level of performance by the frontline staff, either for the children that they are instructing or even for their own performance as measured by the youth PQA. Rather, we're asking the site supervisor to submit the artifacts that are evidence that the continuous improvement process, the 4 key practices, assess, plan, coach, and train, have in fact occurred. So we're holding a site manager accountable for a continuous improvement process rather than a group of staff accountable for a specific level of performance, either of their own teaching or for child outcomes. Trying to advance the slide. And so we conducted a randomized trial for the youth program intervention between 2007 and 2010. The trial occurred in 87 sites in 5 out-of-school time networks in 4 states. We selected a group of sites in each of those 5 networks and randomly assigned about 9 sites to treatment and 9 to control in each of the 5 states. Our primary outcome of interest was the quality of instruction. So we used the youth PQA amongst some other measures as our primary outcome. and we did this set of practices. We trained site managers to implement the 4 core practices and to use the youth PQA in their sites. And then we showed up at the end of the year to see randomly selecting staff activities to see if staff performances were actually higher quality as measured by the youth PQA. We found statistically significant and I think substantively important findings at every step of the chain. So site managers in the YPQI sites engaged in more training that was likely to be associated with the 4 continuous improvement practices. They got more coaching as we delivered the intervention to them. They then walked into their organization and they led the 4 practices in their organization at higher rates than our control group, much higher rates. The staff reported that they had participated in the 4 practices, assess, plan, coach, train, at higher rates than their control group peers. And then those staff walked into the activity settings where they worked with kids and they delivered higher quality instruction. This cascade of effects is very important because it allows us to deliver the intervention to a sample of 1 at each site, to the site supervisor, and then that supervisor comes in and cascades the intervention out to the teachers and youth workers in the setting, and according to our findings from the randomized trial, can indeed have effects on the quality of instruction. Additional findings were that the YPQI worked across challenging staffing conditions and increased staff retention. By challenging staffing conditions, we mean that a manager's turnover during the intervention year, the education levels of the staff, and the adult-child ratios in the setting did not moderate the size of the effect. They did not erase the effect in those settings where those challenging conditions occurred. We also learned that higher implementation, if staff were engaged in more of the 4 core practices, assess, plan, coach, train, the quality of their instruction was higher. We found that there were marginally significant but substantively important effects on staff retention. We found that the YPQI was equally effective across the 5 different networks, different types of after-school programs. And we argue that the YPQI, we compare it to other types of interventions and argue that you could be considered sustainable and cost-effective. Several of the effects that we were able to measure in year 2 were all positive and statistically significant in the treatment group sites, so they had maintained the levels of performance from one year to the next. So we consider this an important set of findings in a very rigorous trial, demonstrating that with a fairly light intervention, you can affect the quality of staff performance. You can create an adult learning system in multiple organizations in a network. To date, the youth PQA and YPQI have achieved a reach as described on the map and in the boxes to the right. These maps can be kind of deceptive. We're not working in all of these states, in every program in these states, but in individual systems in these states. We figure at this point we're working in about 70 networks with 2,600 sites that we can count. That's a conservative estimate. And then we use multipliers from our study to estimate the number of staff and kids that are in programs affected by the youth PQA or where quality is defined by the youth PQA as its standard. So is out-of-school time, is this an out-of-school time teacher training model? We would obviously answer that question, yes, we think it is. We think it's a way to build adult learning systems. There are similar kinds of systems happening in the quality rating and improvement systems that are currently being built in early childhood and school-age care. There are many teacher evaluation systems that are being put in place around the country in a very high-stakes sense, where observation is being used to measure teacher performance. The big question for those systems is how effectively they will use that data collected to feed back to the teachers, to build learning communities around that information so that people can actually try to change performance or behavior defined as instruction and adult-child interaction. But we would answer the question, yes, we think this is an out-of-school time teacher training model. In this last slide, this is maybe a little hard to see, but the general point is not only are the challenges to training teachers and out-of-school time in important ways very similar, in other important ways, the content is also pretty similar. When we think about not the content of the curriculum, but the types of instructional practices that are important in those settings. Here we have a crosswalk of the youth PQA and the Promising Practices Rating Scale, another prominent quality measure in the out-of-school time field, crosswalk with the class secondary scale, which is one of the leading measures in the out-of-school time in middle schools and high schools for teacher performance across subject areas in middle schools and high schools. These instruments are all under development. They are being refined as we speak. So this slide doesn't hold in a permanent kind of way. But the point is that for creating a warm and inviting environment and using high-quality instructional practices, in fact, look quite a bit alike in school day and out-of-school time settings. Not all, but there are many parallels there. So our question is not only should we train these folks in the same way, but what do we do about the parallel content or the parallel practices that could be used in both school and out-of-school time settings? With that, I share my contact information. More information about the YPQI study report is available at the bottom bullet, www.cypq.org/YPQI. There we have all the technical reports and executive summary and policy briefs. With that, thank you, and I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Charles. Now we're going to begin the question and answer session of the webinar. We'll start with a question from the audience. Nancy, I'm going to start with this one. How do you improve the learning culture around OST to encourage staff to become more professional?
Well, that's an interesting question. You get right down to the meat of it in the first question. We have found that bringing staff together, and I'm obviously a huge proponent of peer networking, to support one another, to model professional behavior, it has been really, really helpful in this venue. In terms of improving the learning culture around OST, to become more professional, not really sure what more professional means in this context. So does it mean to be more professionally dressed or a professional demeanor? Does it mean to be more committed to the work and show up on a more regular basis? Does it mean to pursue an advanced degree? I think the first step is developing a sense of professional identity and professional affinity. And so to that, I would say being among other staff in the field who love their job, who are passionate about their jobs, who perceive themselves as professional is the stepping stone to some of the other more concrete elements of professional.
Charles, did you have any thoughts you'd like to add?
I think that's a great answer. I think also being concerned about assuring the safety of staff as they discuss what it is they do and decide how they want to go about doing their work, so that they're in an environment that is very supportive for, and respectful for the practice that is in a setting. Often people are very isolated from each other, and it's hard to feel professional. And in some sense, the definition of professional is I'm able to say publicly, okay, here's what I do, and here's why it's important. Getting past the individual isolation that can occur in programs so that people say, okay, this is the thing we're trying to achieve, here's why it's important.
And I think, too, we didn't talk, either of us, too much about, career ladders and career lattices, and so exposing staff to opportunities for promotion. But both what Charles and I said sort of puts the responsibility on the staff. I think another obvious answer is that the field should take staff more seriously and treat them as professionals, and back to the idea of compensation, wages, benefits, to want staff to aspire to remain in the field and to develop their own professionalism.
And with that, how can OST staff be incentivized to pay for credentialing or training when they're paid so little?
I don't know the answer to that one. I think that that's an evolving issue. One of the questions is related to that is, why would a staff person invest in a degree in this field if there's no similar position available to them as if they invested in a different kind of degree? So whether it's their own money or whether it's somebody else's money, there's still the expenditure. And what is the benefit to having this degree when you come into this field, since it's not exactly required yet? So I think it's very convoluted. It's very complex. It's something that we're talking about in Philly or actually in Pennsylvania, when we're looking both at higher education and we're looking at career lattices and we're looking at competencies and how do they all interrelate. And I think the big idea here is you can't fix one component. You can't develop, let's say, coursework without looking at what's the next step for somebody participating in that coursework. Nor can you, I guess back to your original question, just pay for staff's coursework if at the end it's still not going to necessarily mean advancement for them.
Charles, what necessary core competencies in OST staff seem to be lacking most typically from your work? What have you found?
Well, again, we're really interested in site supervisors, and we find that while the folks who occupy the position of site manager or supervisor tend to be very capable of implementing the continuous improvement work that we work with sites on, they don't have a lot of prior preparation in that area. And, you know, articulating to my staff what it is I want you to do and measuring, you know, your performance against that standard, and then being able to help people think about individual change, feel safe, and feel able to examine the performance feedback that they get. Those are, you know, important management arts, and they're ones that, again, people are very able to do it, but they're typically not very well prepared in that area as they come into a management position. So, you know, the manager role is, for us, a very important one in the out-of-school time field, especially given the levels of turnover in frontline staff. And then for frontline staff, you know, there are a lot of really, really skilled people out there, and then there are a lot of folks who are just brand new to any form of work, and who appreciate some instruction on, you know, what are the developmental needs of kids, how do you keep them engaged, how do you keep them interested, you know, kind of basic even almost caregiving level of skills. So those entry-level skills for frontline staff, I think, are very important too.
Nancy, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's a great response, and I'm thinking about something we just touched on is how is out-of-school time different from a classroom, not necessarily how is an out-of-school time staff person different from a classroom teacher. There's a lot of unique characteristics of out-of-school time. One of them is that it's a fairly informal setting. There's a lot of different subjects, and it's also often a mixed age group. So what we hear often from direct service staff is more training in classroom management, more training in behavior management, more training in positive youth development. So looking at our various surveys and feedback forums, that seems to be a skill that is certainly one of the prevalent OST competencies, but also something that the staff are hungry for. And just to reiterate what Charles said, what we hear from managers and mid-level managers is supervisory skills, looking for ways to interact with staff. I think the other thing is as new content areas emerge, like health and fitness, like science, then there's a need for the content training on those different disciplines so that they feel equipped to do that in their programs.
Well, on that note, one of the audience members asked, what are the 3 most important classroom management techniques you think OST staff should possess?
I'll take a stab at that one because the way that we often answer that question, coming again out of a tradition of the High Scope Educational Research Foundation, we always first want to try to handle issues of classroom management through structure and engagement. So knowing how to be very warm, how to be welcoming, how to use kids' names, how to be able to ask questions so that you get some kind of reciprocal kind of dialogue with a kid maybe over a period of sessions. So how to engage a kid in the kind of the relationship level and have them experience warmth, and then structure and interest. Right, you're very clear about what the norms, the boundaries are, what you can and can't do. No aggressive acts. You can't touch. You can't hit. No aggressive words, and there are clear consequences for those kinds of behaviors themselves, which should be positive if possible. But then the rules are clear for how you interact, and then some interesting content. And especially, we try to use planning and reflection and as ways to get kids into content.
And I would totally reiterate what Charles said, and I'll also mention that on the Out of School Time Resource Center's website, we have a document library which is sorted by our staff competencies, and there's multiple documents, research, popular articles about classroom management and out of school time. But I would reinforce what Charles said. Be clear up front what the boundaries are with older kids and even with younger kids to an extent. If you can co-create the guidelines for the program, for the expectations, I think it's important not to be punitive when you're an instructor. So sort of depersonalizing it when, a child, let's say, is misbehaving. I think there's a tremendous amount of literature about positive youth development and an asset approach. So just really instating a positive environment. But I also think that it's important that the instructor is engaging, that the curriculum is engaging. And the more exciting it is, the less likely you're going to have some of the behavior issues. And I think that's a lot easier said than done.
Yes.
How can partnerships and collaboration with the school day, community organizations, and parents help OST programs provide and improve staff training? Nancy, do you have?
Sure. We are working closely with the Philadelphia School District on that. And I think what's really interesting is seeing that the formal school day and the out-of-school time field both have areas of expertise that they can share. So we are looking at opening up many of our, let's say, formal trainings in the out-of-school time field on cultural competency, on classroom management, on positive youth development for classroom teachers. And similarly, a lot of the professional development for the classroom teachers on science, technology, engineering, and math, on individualized learning plans, communicating with parents, continually looking at what we call building a reciprocal training system where staff can attend one another's trainings, but also in those trainings work together and learn from one another. We have a really remarkable program in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Practitioner Fellowship Project, or the After School Matters Practitioner Fellowship Program, which brings classroom teachers and out-of-school time staff together in a year-round practitioner inquiry research program, which is another way of providing a venue in which after-school and classroom teachers can work together. And I know this question comes up a lot, and sometimes there's a systemic way to get cohesion between the school day and the after school, and sometimes it's just on an individual school-by-school basis. And again, in our document library and others' websites, there's a lot of literature, sort of steps and tips and nuts and bolts for forging relationships between out-of-school time and classroom staff.
Yeah, and I would answer that on the school side, after-school programs, anyways, a subset of out-of-school time, we think should be part of comprehensive school reform. They should be seen as valuable a learning environment as the school day, where lots of really interesting other kinds of opportunities with lower adult-child ratios and much more freedom about content are available, but also that the after-school folks, they have to also realize that the school day teachers know a heck of a lot about these kids and families, and so you can get a ton of great information about who the kids are and what they need from the school folks, and then after school represents this great opportunity to do different kinds of things. So we think that they should be highly integrated. On the parent side, there's a lot of great innovation that we run into. It doesn't seem to be as formalized, like, there's not a home visit like we see in early childhood, or a marking period, or a check-in on grades like we see, on how the kid is done in the program, like we see in the school day and in early childhood. After school hasn't really developed those norms as a field yet for how we do. They're really wide and uniform and common about how we engage parents. So I think that one's still pretty wide open, although there's lots of great work going on locally and individually.
This question came in from our audience. How do you encourage continuous improvement when programs are understaffed and individual staff are already pressed for time? For example, little to no planning time. And I would add to that, in the high turnover rate, that the program continues to self-assess and self-improve. Charles, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. So in the 4 elements of continuous improvement in the YPQI, that took about 124 hours of staff time over 18 months to get all the training and to implement the 4 continuous improvement practices. So compared to other kinds of interventions, that's not a ton of time, although in, a part-time field with part-time staff, it can be, an insurmountable challenge. So there are some places where it doesn't work, where there are not enough resources. But we have had a remarkable amount of success. Almost all the work we do is on an annually renewed contract. So if folks don't want to do it, if they don't think it fits, they don't have to come back, and they keep coming back. So we think that in the field, especially the active self-assessment, has been very useful for, adult education purposes. People like to observe each other and think about what the scores mean and produce the rating and then decide what to do. There's a clear incentive in there, which is kind of clarity, knowing what to do and what we're really working on. Again, that not all sites can pull it off. The argument clearly is to flip it over and say, how do you make sure that all systems have it, even if we're using this lower wage, younger workforce who, bring their enthusiasm and don't leave with a giant paycheck, even if that's the way the system is often set up, how do we give those folks that staff, an important and useful learning experience while they're here? And part of that is time to do continuous improvement and planning.
And I think I sort of see that question in 2 different parts. How do you convince administrators and supervisors that it's a good use of their staff time?
Right.
I think the accountability and the measurements and the qualitative and quantitative data on staff impact, program impact, et cetera, is really useful. If it's about how do you convince staff that it's a good use of their time, I think that's a little bit more complicated in some ways. I know just practically one solution is to have more on-site, let's say, trainings and workshops. On the other hand, we hear from staff that they like getting out of the building and they like mingling with people from other programs. I will say that with our peer networking meetings, we always ask of the staff, how many of you were required to be here? And very few people that come to these meetings, and we have between 40 and 60 people at each meeting, very few people are required to be there, and very few people are looking for any kind of credits or certificates. So there's something motivating them to come during their, day to this professional development opportunity. And when we ask them specifically, what is it that makes you want to be here, it's the opportunity to network with peers, the opportunity to share some of my triumphs and some of my challenges.
From the audience, should OST rules, boundaries, consequences, and curriculum align to schools as much as possible? If not, what would be some rewards and repercussions?
I think that's that's where Charles's initial comment, it depends. Not all out-of-school time programs are school-based. Not all of them are allied with a school. Some of them are developed specifically to give an alternative to the school day. A lot of the sports programs, a lot of the more recreational programs, not that they don't have a youth development component or an academic component. I don't know what the utility would be to have them allied with the school curriculum or the school standards. On the other hand, if it's a school-based program, if they're working with the same population of kids that were in that school during the day, if it's funded by the Department of Education, absolutely to reinforce, not repeat, but to reinforce some of the curricula and some of the standards that are happening in the school day. I think the bottom line is that it's always important to coordinate with the school, with the neighborhood school, with the school district, to pool resources, to treat the kids as our kids and recognize what they're doing after school and during the day are completely related. But the extent to which the after-school program is acutely aligned with the school day program, I think really varies from circumstance to circumstance.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer to that. And, there are some places around the country, the city of Nashville, Tennessee, for example, where they are building capacity to serve kids in the out-of-school time hours, often in schools, but also in community-based organizations, and they have a definition of what a high-quality setting looks like, but at the same time, they have access to the school district. The site leaders have access to the school district's records about how the kids are doing, and there's a lot of information available in those records. it's taken a lot of work to build the technology to make that information available and make it useful, because we're drowning in data we can't use. But, you know, those are sites that they have the positive youth development frame for the experience the kids have, but they're also looking at the information from the school district on a regular basis.
I think that's a great point.
Oh, sorry, go on.
That's all. I'll stop there. Great point.
Lastly, this is going to be our last question because we're almost out of time, and it's related. Will increasing the professionalization of OSG staff take away some of the distinct traits that make these staff so relatable and appealing to students in out-of-school programs?
I don't know. What do you think, Charles?
I think that's a great question, and I think that's a danger. I mean, it certainly is. We did with our partners at Michigan State, we did a survey using the Michigan 21st Century data, 350 sites, and we found that this was several years ago. In 2006, there were something like 90,000 slots of programming delivered by outside vendors. And when you step into a field like, for example, especially STEM, where expertise can come, you know, you've got to kind of go to people who have expertise in those areas. You can't just tell somebody to learn the content tomorrow to give a coherent activity around engineering. If we went to one kind of qualification for an out-of-school time staff person, you might not get the guy who's a mechanic for NASCAR to come in and work with the kids, and that kind of stuff really is, you know, the Audubon Society, Save the Bay, especially in the STEM area, the boat builders, the PASA folks in Rhode Island are a great example of bringing community educators, community expertise into after-school settings, and I sure would hate to lose that.
And I would just totally agree with Charles. I think that the idea of credentialing, the idea of professionalizing, it's absolutely essential. There's in my mind, there's no argument against looking at credentials, looking at college coursework, looking at professionalism. But you have to do that in the context of reality, and then also in the context of the other kinds of resources that are available to and accessible to out-of-school time programs. So it's not about whether or not people should become credentialed. It's about whether or not that becomes the only gauge, the only filter through which people can enter the workforce.
Okay, well, thank you both. That's all we have time for today, and thank you, audience, for participating. So we'd like to remind you that if you want to watch today's presentation again, an on-demand archive will be made available through edweek.org within the next 24 hours. Additionally, if you'd like to learn more about today's topic, you can visit edweek.org to find articles that explore this topic. Thank you.